All right, good afternoon and welcome. Thank you all for your patience and thank you for joining us today. I'm Samantha and we are excited for the opportunity to present you with our next installment of our webinar series. Today will be direct contracting, friend or foe to ACOs and physicians. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's webinar. You will see a user control panel on your computer desktop in the upper left-hand corner. You can listen in via your computer speakers, or if you would prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the questions tab. You may send these in at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the question and answer sessions at the end of today's presentation. With that, I'm going to turn over the presentation to David Kilbonis.
Well, David, how about it? Do you mind if I jump in and start first?
No, please start.
Okay, thank you. Thank you again for everybody for joining. We really appreciate your time today. Sorry for the slow start. What we'd like to do today is just share some really good information on direct contracting. We know that many of you are considering it or being approached by a lot of people outside. So with the help of some of our industry experts, we thought we would share some of our findings with you. So today we've invited Colleen Norris and Brent Jensen from Milliman, and they're going to set up the conversation and talk a little bit about direct contracting and some of the intricacies about it. So happy to answer any questions. We know a lot of this is very complex and nuanced. And then we're going to turn it over to David Kilbonis. He's done a really deep drill down on some of the nuances of the contracting and some of the offers that are being offered to the independent physicians in the state of Florida. So he's going to give us a really good lesson on what his findings. And then we will hear from Nicole Bradbury, our president and CEO of Flacos. And then we will also talk about ValueH a little bit. Okay, I think I will turn this over to Colleen. Can we share the screen so she can share her slides?
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Kelly. And just to confirm, it's good on the screen share?
Yep.
Great. So thank you again. Like Kelly said, my name is Colleen Norris. I'm with Milliman. We're going to get started by giving you a bit of a general overview of the direct contracting model and how it compares to existing CMS risk-sharing programs, namely MSSP and NextGen ACO. We think that it's really important to consider and be aware of direct contracting through two different lenses. The first is how direct contracting entities actually experience the model directly as they relate to CMS. So this includes how benchmarks are set, how attribution happens, how the financial settlement terms work, and then also what makes a provider group successful in the eyes of a DCE. And then the second lens, which is actually a little more important, especially for everyone on today's call, is how direct contracting as a program impacts providers that are actually direct contracting with direct contracting entities. We think that if you're involved in this program at all, it's really important to understand the program through both lenses. So we're going to touch a little bit on each, but we're going to really focus more on the provider perspective and some of the crucial elements that we think you need to be aware of if you're participating in this program so that you can do so intelligently and in a way that makes sure that if you are participating, it's meeting the goals of your group in the way that you expect. So since MSSP and NextGen ACOs have been around for many years, we think it can be helpful to compare direct contracting terms of the program up against those existing programs to kind of look at similarities and differences to give you an overview of how this program functions. So first, let's focus on comparing some aspects of the benchmark. I'm not going to go through every feature of this table in detail because it's pretty complicated, but I want to highlight a few items. First, there is regional adjustment in direct contracting, similar to what we have in MSSP and NextGen ACO, but it's based on a different source of data. This is a prospective rate book, which CMS develops ahead of time in a somewhat similar fashion to what they do for Medicare Advantage, although the actual results are a little bit different. This is helpful because you know what it is ahead of time, and it's also a little bit different than what's done for MSSP. MSSP, it's after the fact. CMS goes back and looks at the readable population and figures out what the cost for a region would be, for the nation would be, and blends it with your ACO. For direct contracting, it's done ahead of time. This is something that you should be aware of, not only because it's a difference, but because it impacts different ACO entities differently. We found this when we've done evaluations. Some groups, depending on the region and their provider composition, do distinctly better under one mechanism than the other. So it's just something to be aware of. There's no uniform answer there. So if you've heard from some of your other friends in the industry that they think they'll do better or worse under one method or the other, still check for yourself. Secondly, there's the quality withhold in direct contracting generally, and then there's a discount in direct contracting global. This is important because it creates a higher hurdle to achieving gross savings as compared to MSSP. So basically, in MSSP, you have your historical benchmark, it gets trended and risk adjusted forward, that's what you're competing against. I'm oversimplifying here, but if you kind of take those similar steps and they happen for direct contracting, then what it does is it takes your benchmark and it kind of sets it back a little bit in the direct contracting global. Quality has a similar effect. You know, the idea is that discounts your benchmark by 5%, but then you can earn some of that back, potentially with a bonus too, so that helps. But this is a little bit different than MSSP, which up until recently has just been an adjustment to shared savings, or more recently has become a hurdle kind of step function to either getting or not achieving your shared savings rate. So with a few of, and then, oh, finally, one more thing I wanted to mention about the difference between direct contracting and MSSP is risk adjustment. So it's actually described in the same way on this slide, in this table, and that's because at a very high level, the two approaches look very similar. They're actually pretty different though, and Brent and David will discuss that a little bit more later in this presentation. So given this approach to the benchmark, we want to talk a little bit briefly about how actual direct contracting entities are going to look at providers and the beneficiaries they bring in terms of what would make a provider look favorable under these terms of how benchmarks measured. So obviously, a direct contracting entity working with providers is going to want to work with providers that they think are going to either increase the benchmark or decrease expenditures, or both, really, that's the idea. For standard DCEs, this means that they will be looking for providers with a track record of high quality scores, positive regional adjustment, and a track record of, or just general high level of engagement with comprehensive risk coding. Risk coding is handled differently in direct contracting, like I mentioned, I'll be discussed later, but like MSSP, it's still important. So that will be something that's looked for. Obviously, direct contracting entities will also be looking to engage with providers that have identified opportunities for better care management, or they're willing to engage with other DCE activities, or of course, providers that contract with a favorable alternative payment mechanism. This will be much of the focus of the rest of this presentation. So one of the things I want to point out, it's important to note that a track record of low expenditures is not directly on this list. So low expenditures in the past do help to increase the regional adjustment, but they're kind of a secondary factor. You know, ultimately, they're not the key driver of future savings because you're competing against your past experience. So it's just one thing to consider when you're thinking about how direct contracting entities might evaluate you as part of this program. I'll just briefly touch on how this looks for new entrant DCEs. The overall picture of what's considered a successful provider from the perspective of increasing the benchmark and decreasing expenditures is similar. The main difference is there's much greater focus on regional adjustments, since that's kind of the core driver of the benchmark. All right, so we've talked a good bit about how direct contracting works with the benchmark and how it compares to MSSP. We want to look also at how the financial settlement parameters compare to MSSP and NextGen ACO. So one of the most obvious differences here is the shared savings rate. So many entities that might be considering direct contracting may have been comparing themselves, or perhaps are still comparing themselves, between MSSP Enhanced and Direct Contracting Professional and Direct Contracting Global. As you can see here, Direct Contracting Professional has a 50% shared savings rate. there's a little bit of nuance to that. There are some corridors when you have very high or shared savings or very high shared losses, but essentially 50%. MSSP, if you're talking about the basic tracks, it's more or less 50% for anything that's probably relevant here. For basic E, it's 50%. And for enhanced, it's 75%. So if, you know, thinking about the gradations of shared savings, you know, direct contracting professionals, 50, MSSP would be 75. Direct contracting global is where you get the most savings, and that's 100%. It's important to note here that this 100%, the way CMS takes their cut is that discount that we've already discussed. You know, at some point, that's where the shared part of the shared savings comes in. You know, you get to keep all of it, but you only get to keep all of it after you've achieved a certain hurdle rate, and that hurdle rate becomes a little bit high in the out years. The shared loss rates also differ a little bit. You can see here they're symmetrical in the direct contracting program. This is another place where this differs from MSSP. MSSP, they're always lopsided. So the shared savings rate is higher than the shared loss rate, except for some very unusual circumstances with the enhanced track, but those are very rarely triggered. And then there's a few more items here that, you know, come into play. There's minimum corridors. Those are just not really a thing with direct contracting. And then finally, there's capitation. This has just not really been a significant component of CMS risk sharing programs up until now. I don't want to say it hasn't been there, because it has, but this is where direct contracting gets its name from, right? This is the huge emphasis of the program of how is risk going to be shared with providers, and how is that going to be done properly. So we're going to talk about a few different things. I'm going to start with talking about the effective use of alternative payment mechanisms, and then hand it over to Brent to talk about some of the mechanics of how it's done under professional and global. So obviously, as I just mentioned, the huge, you know, one of the drivers of this program is that direct contracting entities have a lot of flexibility with how they can enter into unique alternative payment arrangements with participant and preferred providers. So there's many ways that these arrangements can be structured. You may have been approached by direct contracting entities yourself and have probably seen a wide variety of contracts. We're not going to go over all of those permutations on this webinar, because frankly, there's just way too many options to cover. And there's so many nuances that can make a contract good or bad. We do want to focus on 3 principles that should be considered when either structuring these arrangements, or if you're in the position of evaluating one, how you should consider it from that perspective. So first of all, any arrangement should incentivize areas that either are identified for improvement or that you think you can improve. They should be tied, they can be tied to the total cost of care, but they could also be tied to quality, risk coding, or a condition specific for improvement, utilization, spending outcomes. There's many ways that these can be structured that aren't total cost of care. If you're a provider considering one of these arrangements, you might want to think about carefully what's appropriate for your area of practice. You know, if you're a specialist or a subspecialist, or even, you know, someone that's not a primary care provider, total cost of care really may not be the right measure, because you might be interacting with someone in a certain point in their care pathway, and you can meaningfully impact their health and care, but in a way that's different than the whole spectrum of their costs over a year. This leads to the next point, which is that the payment mechanism should be appropriate for the provider and the beneficiaries they manage. So I already mentioned total cost of care can be effective for PCPs, but for a specialist, it might be better to have episodic related payment structures or something else. This is an area where data can be used to really determine what might be the most appropriate course. And then finally, it's important to consider if the arrangement is sustainable and then mutually beneficial. This is something we always tell direct contracting entities, because a lot of times I think there can be a motivation to kind of push down reimbursement as far as possible, as quickly as possible, and that's clearly not sustainable. These really need to be structured in a way that's mutually beneficial for the long term. So from that perspective, there are a few best practices that you should consider, either if you're in the position of creating one of these contracts or reviewing one. So, and this is just from our experience of looking at many, many contracts. The front-end design is important, but a detailed review of the contract and scenario testing is so important to make sure that the payment mechanism is functioning as intended. So in other words, let's say you're a provider, you've met with someone from a direct contracting entity, they tell you how the contract is supposed to work and it sounds good to you. That's not enough. You need to go into the contract and actually do the homework here and make sure it works the way it's intended. And lawyers, while they can be helpful to review this, are more focused on the legal aspects of the contract. So I think looking at this with an analytical eye or finding someone that can help you do that is important too. So there's a few best practices I would stress here. So the first one is looking for imprecise or incomplete contract language that can result in unintended consequences for the designed alternative payment mechanism. So what this means is, you know, when you read through the contract and it says, okay, here's benchmark, here's this, here's how it will be settled, that might seem fine, but then when you actually have your data and you go to settle the terms of the contract, you might find that there's insufficient information in the contract to actually calculate those items, that there's details or quite a few details that you need that you don't have. Looking at that closely, determining if there are any of those issues are important to do upfront, because it can leave you in a vulnerable position later on if that detail's not in there and one party pushes for their own advantageous interpretation. The second best practice would be to adjudicate the contract terms against 5 or 10 test cases if you can. So, and this would include cases that are specifically designed to kind of represent extremes of what could potentially occur within the contract terms. So this is really important to identify what I just said, areas where the contract language is not sufficient to actually adjudicate for a particular case. And the second one is look for elements of the alternative payment mechanism that might diverge from what you expect, because, you know, as always, can always create situations where the terms of the contract look good, but when it is applied to a given individual, it may not look so good, or just might not function the way you intend it to. And then the third one here is looking for areas in which, this is providers, but it should just be both parties could potentially game the contract. We want this contract to be set up from the get-go in a way where there's just no disputes, no potential for either party to kind of twist it to their advantage. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Brent to discuss a few more aspects of capitation and then some features of risk coding.
Sure, thanks, Colleen. And yeah, you know, Colleen really described it well. You know, these alternative payment mechanisms under direct contracting, or I guess I should say GPDC, is really a unique part of this CMMI program. And so when you know, on one of Colleen's earlier slides, she highlighted that under either the professional or the global options that providers are going to be capitated, or capitation is required. Now, just talking really briefly about kind of the mechanics of this, how this works in practice is CMS is going to pay the direct contracting entity a capitated amount for all the participant providers. And it's going to be based on an estimate of historical claims data. But then that direct contracting entity is ultimately responsible for sharing the capitation amount they receive from CMS with those participating providers. So just because the DCE is receiving a capitation amount doesn't necessarily mean that the contract that the DCE has with any provider is going to be a capitated arrangement. It can be any of these APMs, these alternative payment mechanisms or contracts that Colleen's been talking about. And so that's one of the reasons why I think, you know, as we've done work in this area, and Colleen mentioned, you know, reviewed contracts, not only understanding the contract, but how it relates to the broader global professional direct contracting program, can really help providers understand and make sure that they're setting yourselves up for success under these alternative payment mechanisms. So that's the, you know, one additional comment that I'd add there on the capitation piece and these alternative payment mechanisms. If you go forward, Colleen, to the risk coding slides, what I really want to jump into now is one of the big differences that Colleen mentioned is risk coding and risk adjustment, how it's captured, how it was captured in MSSP or is, and how it's captured in the GPDC program. So you can see here on this slide, under MSSP, there's a risk score cap of 3%, and that 3% is compared to benchmark year 3. Now, the fact that it's compared to benchmark year 3 is an important nuance to some of the differences that we'll talk about. There's no coding intensity factor that gets applied, which I'll talk about in a sec, and there's no cap on the risk score drops. So it's not a symmetrical 3% up and down. It's just a cap on 3% increases to the risk scores. Now, if we look at GPDC and how risk coding works there, the cap is symmetrical. So your risk score, if it goes up 3%, more than 3%, it's going to get capped. But it also, if it goes down more than 3%, it's going to get capped. So there's a little bit of protection on the downside too under GPDC. And you also notice that it's compared to a reference year. So the reference year generally is 2 years prior to the performance year that's under review. CMS did leave themselves some wiggle room there to make some decisions down the road and potentially adjust what that reference year is. But in general, it's 2 years prior to the performance year. And GPDC also introduces this coding intensity factor. And what this really does is this puts a limit on how much the overall nationwide risk scores can increase. And it's benchmarked back to 2019. So if nationwide risk scores are going up, 1% every year, ultimately, as a DCE and as providers participating in that DCE, in order to benefit from risk coding and risk adjustment, your risk scores would also need to go up at least 1%, because ultimately it's going to get adjusted back with this coding intensity factor to 2019 risk score levels. So there are these differences, and it's really interesting as I've looked at some of the numbers and the impact of these. It's not clear exactly what the direction, some of these are good impacts in the sense that it makes the risk adjustment more favorable in GPDC. Some have an opposite effect. So sometimes it's offsetting and it's a little bit hard to digest. I've outlined a couple of the highlights here, and then I'll jump into a specific example. So as I mentioned, using benchmark year 3 for the risk score cap in MSSP, what that does is it actually makes it harder to have risk coding improvements in future years. So as a provider, some of those efforts to capture better risk scores and then potentially get a larger share of shared savings and contribute to the ACO shared savings becomes more challenging in future years. But alternatively, not having a coding intensity factor adjustment can help allow for additional improvements. Under GPDC, the reference year, since it's shifting, generally speaking, and just 2 years prior to the performance year, does allow for some additional improvements. But this coding intensity factor does really have a pretty significant effect on the possible risk scores that you can achieve. And if we go to the next slide, Colleen, I'm going to jump into 2 examples. And these are, as I was looking through examples, there's probably half a dozen examples that you could show of different scenarios. But what I did here is I picked 2 that I found most interesting. And also, as I was looking at this, one thing I want to point out is that looking at the different methodologies in performance year 1 wasn't always the same answer as what you would get in performance year 3. So looking at this, the 2 examples that I've outlined here, on the left, you have an example where the ACO or the DCE risk trend is outpacing the national risk score trend. On the right, we have an example where the trends are consistent. You have the same trends for the ACO as you do and the DCE as you do nationwide. So if you go to the next step here, here's what I want to highlight on the first example where the trend for the ACO or the DCE outpaces national trend. You'll notice under the MSSP program or the ACO actually gets a better normalized risk score than you would get under the GPDC program as a DCE. And a lot of this is due to the fact that you have the benchmark year, the 3% cap, since it's compared to the benchmark year, which in performance year 1 is just the year prior, you have more opportunity for improvement. Under GPDC, you're actually comparing to 2 years prior, so the opportunity to actually improve and not hit the cap becomes more difficult. If you go to the next slide, you can see that shifts when you get to performance year 3 to the point where it's actually, you get a better risk score under the GPDC program than you would under the ACO or MSSP. So it's an interesting effect that it's not consistent from one performance year to the next. And really, you know, as a provider looking at these opportunities of DCEs coming in and talking about opportunities to participate, understanding your risk mix and what you might contribute in terms of attributed beneficiaries is important to look at, and not just think about in the sense of a single performance year, but over a long-term period, what some of these effects might be of risk coding. Now, if we look at the second example here, you can see across the board, if an ACO or a DCE is just staying consistent with national trend, because of this coding intensity factor adjustment under GPDC, it actually is more beneficial to stay in an MSSP program because those MSSP risk scores aren't getting trued up back to 2019 risk score levels. They're able to continue increasing, and as long as it's staying under that 3% threshold and you're consistent with national trend, you're going to have a 1.0 normalized risk score. But that risk score, even if they're increasing, because the nationwide risk scores are increasing and yours are increasing, you're going to get adjusted back to 2019 levels, and it actually, once you normalize, decreases your normalized risk adjustments or risk scores. So if we go to the next slide here, what I'm going to finish up with is just kind of talking about broadly what some of these programs, you know, you think about all the different parameters, calling layout. This really highlights and illustrates what, you know, if you put all those together, what it means and what the savings opportunity is. So just quickly describing what we're looking at here. In this graph across the bottom or the x-axis, this is your gross savings. So total savings that a DCE or an ACO has been able to generate. And then across the y-axis or on the left, it's the actual shared savings. So after you apply, you know, the 50% or the 75% under basic enhanced, or the 100% under GPDC with the risk corridors. And what you can really see is the different levels of upside and downside risk that each of these tracks offer. So, you know, one of the things that I think a lot of DCEs are considering as they approach providers and try to set up contracts with them is the opportunity to share in upside or downside risk, for providers to share in that risk. And so, you know, it's important, especially if that language is in a contract, to understand and think about what the shared savings might look like. What is the potential for generating gross savings or losses at certain levels, and what does that ultimately mean for shared savings or losses? And you can see, depending on the track, you know, GPDC Global has one of the highest risk, highest reward opportunities. So making sure that's consistent with the provider's risk tolerance and risk levels is an important consideration. But on this last slide, what I've done here, if you go to the next one, Colleen, is zoomed in a little bit. So you can really see one of the effects of this GPDC program. You know, under the global, there is a discount that gets applied to the benchmark. And so what that does in practice is when it comes to generating shared savings, there is, you know, inherently a 2% minimum savings that has to be generated before any shared savings are shared back. In fact, you actually generate losses, shared losses, if you don't reduce expenditures beyond 2%. And that's because this discount, and I say 2% is what the discount is in year one, and that actually increases up your performance years 5 and 6 to 5%. And so that becomes an increasingly more challenging target for DCEs to hit, and becomes important as you know, to think about as DCEs are making these contracts and working with providers, that's something that they have in mind. And so understanding the details of how the programs work, understanding the details of some of the nuances, you know, risk coding and what that might mean for opportunities as a provider, and the payment mechanisms of how the contracting is going to work, like Colleen talked about, are all going to be very key pieces for any provider group that's looking to contract with a DCE, or even just renew, you know, a contract with an MSSP or an ACO in an MSSP program. So with that, I think that concludes our thoughts. David, I think I turn it over to you.
Great. So, hey, good afternoon, everybody. That was some really great information. That's the sophistication that we were hoping to talk through when trying to help ACOs make decisions as to what's the best track for them. I'm from Palm Beach ACO in South Florida, and you know, we see some interesting things in South Florida, you know, sort of tip of the spear often of the creativity of some of the messaging to providers. And it's interesting is that there's been the most amount of confusion from physicians on what their compensation is going to look like between MSSP and direct contracting, which is part of the reason why we asked to have this meeting is, you know, if we can support education so the physicians make the best possible decisions, and then eliminate any misinformation, we hope that there's the least amount of heartache for these hardworking doctors as they're working hard to manage their patients and hit these incentives. So quick snapshot for us is, like many ACOs in Florida, we're also successful in the shared savings program. One thing is that we learned a long time ago that CMMI can be a risk. So the Innovation Center is coming out with new programs, and the vendors really aggressively market them. They market the programs as being the next best thing. You know, they potentially say that the ACO is phasing out in favor of this new program, and then they often get the financials wrong. And I don't know that they're doing it on purpose. You know, now that we participate in many of the CMMI programs, you know, you have to really dig into the fine print, and then often they give you the financial details after the program's already started. So it may not necessarily be on purpose, but there just often is a lot of confusion about the CMMI financial details. So, you know, we currently do BIPSI, bundle payment. We do primary care first. We do kidney care first when it starts. And then we do have an approved contract for direct contracting global. And, you know, as Brent pointed out, you know, the direct contracting global has potentially the highest risk and the highest reward. There are some drawbacks, but one thing he didn't mention was the repayment mechanism is substantially higher on direct contracting global. So if you look at those lines for the upside, you can see that the enhanced MSSP is pretty close, but we would have to put up 6 times, so 600% more repayment mechanism under the MSSP rules. So we looked really close at both programs, and we think they're both attractive to some folks, but for us, it was a lot better to have a lot more ROI on the capital that we had to put up in order to take downside risk. So we really like the MSSP enhanced program right now. Picture's worth 1,000 words. So this is an all-member meeting for our organization. This is pre-COVID. Believe it or not, we had about the same amount of people in a post-COVID meeting about 2 weeks ago. You know, you never get anything back, so I didn't want to put that picture on the internet, but everyone was masked and vaccinated. But the point is that our group, like many of yours, it's successful and engaged, and we're concerned about the misinformation of dividing up the doctors. So here are the things that we were hearing from other folks. You know, candidly, they would call us up and say, hey, we know you've been good to us. We appreciate the performance payments, but I'm being offered 200, 300% of what you offer me. And, I need to do this for our family. And then we said, wow, we have an approved application. We work with CMMI. We just don't see what you're saying. And Colleen and Brent sort of commented on that. But again, they may not be doing it on purpose. And the salespeople for these companies, they're not as qualified as Colleen and Brent. But some of the things that they would say is, hey, we're going to offer you all this money up front, and there's no strings attached. And as you know, the direct contracting program, the purpose of it is to protect the Medicare Trust Fund. So ultimately, if there's too much money paid on the front end, it'll have to be paid back in the losses on the back end. So, to think that this program is an extra payout, this is the federal government, and they don't typically do that. Another thing that we heard from the doctors was that, hey, this is going to be just like Medicare Advantage. So here in South Florida, Medicare Advantage is attractive and the doctors do very well. They often do better than what we can offer them with fee-for-service and attractive ACO payments. It's just a fact down here. But as Brent pointed out, the payment structure does have a cap. You can't increase your risk scores by 40% and increase your funding by 40%, as often folks do. So that's clearly a misconception. And then the big question that I have out there is, these organizations that potentially are recruiting physicians from you, that doctor is going to be really upset if there's a huge mismatch in their expectations and their comp. So that's going to ruin the physician's relationship with that entity. And then another question to ask is, what happens if that entity overpays on the front end and they're losing a lot of money? What is going to be the reaction? So these are just sort of the comments that we were working through with our physicians that are, looking at all their options. So as Colleen and Brent pointed out, that every direct contracting entity was going to have their own physician contracts, and there's an unlimited amount, and they're all going to have different fine print on the comp model, right? What I wanted to point out is that when you choose the capitation with the direct contracting entity, you assign all of your Medicare fee-for-service to them. So there's a great deal of trust that they're going to come through with those payments because your fee-for-service stops. With Medicare Advantage, often these are new patients and there's not quite that risk. So, if the payments are a lot less than the physician thought, that could be a problem. And then God forbid there's some type of solvency or payment delay. It's just something to think about with the direct contracting because these entities do have quite a bit of power. But like I said, we were approached by several physicians. They said, hey, we're going to get $100 PMPM. One said they were going to get $150 PMPM. They said they couldn't afford to stay in our ACO. And, they were kind enough to share some of the fine print. But the fine print, as you look here, it puts this top number here. But man, it has a lot of holdbacks. And for whatever reason, the physicians we worked with, they didn't see any of these holdbacks. So, like Colleen said, it's very important to read your contract so you're not disappointed around payment time. But what it said specifically was it said that it is minus a leakage adjustment. So what that means is these are fee-for-service patients. They can see any PCP they want. And anytime they do see another PCP, that comes out of your cap. We have snowbirds in our area, and there's a significant amount of that would reduce the cap. What's interesting is risk scores cannot be compared without normalization. So, you heard a lot of comments from the Milliman team who are very sophisticated, but you have to make sure you're talking apples to apples. And when I'm looking through this, and I'll share this with you, normalized versus raw risk scores are radically different. One of our doctors, they asked their biller, this wasn't a Milliman employee, this was just their biller. They said, how many Medicare fee-for-service patients do I have and what do I get PMPM? And what they did is they ran that on total patients and not assigned patients. And what's interesting in our organization, we have a total of 100% Medicare patients, but only 60% are assigned. So if you're doing your calculations on 100%, but there's only 60%, you can be radically different. So, you know, that's something to look out in the fine print. And then, like Brent said, there is not an unlimited risk adjustment benefit. So be careful. Okay, so this is an example chart of how folks are compensated through the capitation. Basically, what the direct contracting entity often will say is, we'll pay you a capitated rate on your primary care capitation based on how sick your patients are. And it's usually a sliding scale. If you have a doctor that's family practice and their patients aren't that sick, they're probably not seeing them very often, and a high risk score, a high capitation is not appropriate. But you have a doctor that's an intensivist and they're seeing their patients 8, 9, 10 times a year, right? And that's based on appropriate risk scores, then a much higher capitation rate is appropriate. So what they usually offer is a sliding scale. Well, there's another program that offered a sliding scale, and that's called Primary Care First. And the chart looked just like this. And when physicians applied for the program, they thought that maybe the distribution was about 25% for each one of these programs. So here they thought that they were maybe an average physician with an average risk score, and they would get between the $45 and $100 PMPM capitation. And it was just an example of how risk adjustment can be misunderstood. So we submitted 16 average South Florida physicians to Primary Care First, and the results were staggering. 14 of them were accepted in this top tier, and they were honestly very disappointed on the capitation they received through this program, which is different, but similar with the sliding scale. And then only 2 were accepted under the Group 2 average. And I have to say, one of them was a Center of Excellence physician that sees his patients in the hospital, and they had a raw risk score of 1.75, which normalized comes up to Group 2. So a lot of mismatch between the physician expectation of what their capitation rate was and what it actually was. And then here's the catch, is if the salesperson says to the doctor, what's your risk score, right? And then there's a little bit of confidence behind it. Oh, you know, with Medicare Advantage, I'm about a 1.5. That is an unbelievable misrepresentation. That is far different from what you heard Colleen and Brent talk about. So network leakage, it was in the fine print. Is that significant? Well, in our market, it sure is. So the data that SSP shares with us says that 27% of our claims are going to PCPs outside of our network. So if on average we had doctors in direct contracting, their capitation should be reduced by 27%. Risk normalization, this is a big deal. This is the fine print from the direct contracting global application that we have. And it says in the fine print that the risk score normalization is 1.17. So that means if you have a 1.17 raw risk score, you have to divide it by 1.17 normalization factor to get the figure that's going to be used in your capitation. So the doctors got completely mixed up because they were referring to their raw risk scores, and everything in the financial documents is referring to the normalized ones. So that alone, it'll reduce you by about 17% on your chart. 17% is not the highest we saw. In Dade County, if you look here at age dual, the normalization factor in some cases is 0.82. So the raw risk scores are reduced by 82%. So you got to pay close attention to the fine print if you're going to find out where your contract ends up. The coding intensity factor is a big deal. So they put in the fine print that it's going to be zeroed out. So 3% is the max. Sorry, 3% is the starting point as far as the upside cap. If you have a group that increases the risk scores by 10%, that makes the cap lower for everybody else. So they even put in the fine print that we expect groups to increase the risk scores. So the actual caps for direct contracting global are going to be minus 3.5% to a max of 2.5%. So you don't even get the 3% on the top end. So here's the exercise that we did with an ACO practice. You know, they came in and said we were going to get $100 PMPM. And how does that compare to what the ACO offers? So we did the analysis on assigned patients. They were getting $45 PMPM. The ACO bonus from PBACO on average is about $43 PMPM. So they got about $88. So it's not quite 100, but we pointed out to them that they also weren't a top performer and it could be even higher. And here's what they were compared to. So if you take their $100 PMPM and you reduce what we just discussed about, it could easily be only $55, $60 after clawbacks. So in some cases, the doctors are going to get very close to what they get in fee-for-service with capitation, or they might even get less. And God forbid the ACO doesn't have any shared savings, they could end up significantly different from where they are. And boy, they thought they were getting a much more attractive offering before the analysis. So this is a collaborative effort. We just want to increase the education and we just want to increase the awareness so that providers make the best possible choices on which ACO they choose or which direct contracting entity they choose. So please consider me a resource. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David. Nicole Bradbury here. I'm sorry my camera's not working, but I do want, you know, David and Colleen and Brent, you know, certainly are experts and have gone deep on these models, but I don't want us to take away that direct contracting is not a viable new model that's coming into the marketplace. I think that the message here is be cautious, be able to talk to your doctors about, you know, the pros and cons of each model. But one of the reasons Flacos is involved and sponsored this is because, you know, our mission is really to help these entities that have been forming since 2012, you know, that have been the innovators to drive value-based healthcare in this marketplace. And we want them to stay whole. And whether that's continuing in the ACO models or pivoting over to the direct contracting, you know, at the end of the day, Flacos' mission is really to help them stay viable and flourish, you know, into the future. And so we have created an entity, kind of a sister entity to Flacos called ValueH. And the purpose of that entity is really to help ACOs continue to thrive and no matter what model they're in. And so one of the things that we've taken on is to really pick the best partner for direct contracting and to be able to provide this kind of detailed information when you're making these decisions. And what's going to happen, and David is correct, is that if we don't kind of come out, you know, into the marketplace with a position on this, then our doctors are at real risk of getting picked away one by one because the marketing, the messaging, you know, is all over the place. Doctors are confused, and really the ACO, you know, infrastructure and teams are there to help these doctors succeed in value-based healthcare. And so even if they're going to move to direct contracting, that same infrastructure and team and all the things that we bring that make these models successful needs to stay in place. And so ValueH is working with the DC, and I'm going to let Kelly really go into more details on this, but is working with the DC that we believe is a very good partner that allows the ACOs to stay whole and participate for those that would like to try out these new models. And then we're here for you if you want to just have support to continue in the models you're in. But anyway, with that little commercial on what ValueH, I do want to turn it over to Kelly to talk a little bit more before, because we only have about 9 minutes here before the session's over. But you know, there is light at the end of the tunnel. I think ValueH can really help you work through kind of where you want to be in this marketplace, remain in an ACO or move to direct contracting. So I think if we don't have enough time to get through all the detail, let's figure out how to follow up for those of you that are interested to talk to myself, Kelly, or David, or even the Milliman folks to really think through how you want to move in the future. So anyway, with that, Kelly, I'll turn it over to you. Yep, you're on mute.
Okay, first technical difficulty. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Brent and Colleen and David for, you know, going through all those nuances and all those details. I mean, that's what this is all about. You know, as Nicole said, being part of Flacos, a founding board member of Flacos, David has been there, and Rich Lucabella, and Sheila and Dr. Zucker and all these people we pulled together many years ago. I want to say 2013. We've been studying these things, and we like to think that one of the reasons that ACO has the highest number of successful ACOs is because we've been sharing. We've been kind of caring and sharing with each other. And all of us on this phone are very passionate about protecting the independent physician. And so we built these ACO infrastructures up, and we want to protect them. And we want to try to make sure that as the government is changing, as the administration may put its own mark on changing some of the rules and regulations around direct contracting and GO, we want to make sure that we're ahead, and that's what we've always done. So ValueH is coming along and we started talking about this many years ago, and I think we probably have a lot of our board members on the phone, but we started talking about ValueH several years ago as a direct-to-employer organization. So we could be a statewide association that could help provide direct-to-employer contracts to the ACOs and independents around the state. Since then, the conversations have really wildly changed in the last, I would say, 6 months to a year with the invention of DCEs, because, a lot of ACOs saw DCEs as being a threat to them coming into the market. And as some people have said, maybe picking off their doctors. Well, we want to embrace it, and we want to see it not as a threat, but as a way to understand all of the rules. And I truly believe that's one of the reasons the Florida ACOs were successful, is they did understand the rules of the game, and they tried to figure out how to best you have to at least understand them before you can play in the game, right? So, David, it's something I've seen him do for years, but he does actually read those footnotes on those quarterly utilization and annual reconciliations. He reads every single footnote. And that's why when he came to us and told us some of these findings, we said, we need to tell the broader audience. We need to tell our FLACO constituency throughout the state of Florida. So that's why we wanted to put this on today, but it's not all bad news. I mean, there's some really good news. There's actually some good parts in the direct contracting entity that I didn't hear anybody mention today, so I'll just bring them up. But there is a high performance pull for continuous improvement, and there's going to be a sustained exceptional performance pull. And we didn't bring those up because nobody really knows what they are. Medicare hasn't even figured them out yet, and they haven't even explained them. But basically, the ACOs and the DCEs that figure that stuff out and get there first are going to be the ones that take the money that other ACOs and DCEs are leaving on the table due to quality and not being high performers, or, as Colleen said, not being sustainable. It's one thing to come in and pick away all the low-hanging fruit. It's another thing to have a sustainable model like Palm Beach ACO that started in 2012. Look how far they've come. I sure know that. When I saw your numbers on there, David, what did I see? 1.7 million patients covered lives?
Something like that.
Wow. We started out with 28,500 was the population. So to see an ACO grow to such critical mass like that, and then to have an ACO be willing to share their findings and their learnings with us, it's going to help all of the smaller ACOs and independent physicians that just haven't quite made that step into any one of these alternative payment models. So I did have some slides. I don't think I have time to show them to you, but I guess what I want to say, as an interim CEO of ValueH, I just want to say that we are really going to attempt to continue to do the things that we've been doing, which is advocacy work. Some of you may have received a letter we sent out a couple months ago about how the new 21st Century Cures Act and the EHR and interoperability rules are all coming together this year. So we want to help any ACO, small, large, any physician practice, figure their way through governance, IT governance, because this is really important. This is something we've all really wanted for years and years and years. How do we get interoperability, and how do we get the information we need at point of care? And these new rules are coming together this year, and actually they will start to be implemented next year, and there'll be $1 million fine for any EHR out there that will not transfer information. So, and we have partnered up with Anish Chopra. Many of you know him from Care Journey, but he was the former CTO of Chief Technology Officer of the United States. I do believe he was on the administration transition team. He really does know what's coming down the pike. So he has agreed to help ValueH and FLACOs get the word out, help people make better decisions on their governance so that they can get this stuff. A lot of times you probably already have a FHIR server that can actually receive this data, but you just don't know that the plan is supposed to send it to you. So you just don't know to ask the question. And so we feel like ValueH is going to be there to do that. We're going to provide a suite of enablement services. We're not here to disrupt any ACO. If you have an ACO and it's working well, you have everything working, That's awesome. What we probably will do is we want to pick the best in class physicians, and we want to pick the best in class service providers. So, you know, maybe David has something, maybe Millennium has something, maybe Larry Jones has something, but whatever is the best for the entire state, we're going to use ValueH as that company that's going to provide those enablement services. And we're also going to provide it in a way that's very like almost like a menu. You can pick and choose what you want. Like say you want to just join ValueH and you just want us to help you with advocacy and understand what these new policy rules mean in terms of interoperability, we can do that. Say you're an ACO that can't get a Cigna contract or a Medicare Advantage contract because you're too small, we can help you with that. So there, and the direct employer is going to be pretty awesome. A lot of us have attempted to do that, but we didn't have a big enough footprint. You know, maybe we just had a footprint of Palm Beach and Broward County. Well, to have the entire state, I think that's going to be very interesting to a lot of people. And I also remember a lot of us that started this many years ago, you know, we had hoped to gain more control for the independent physicians and give that autonomy back to them, and not like really, you know, increase the plan's control over us. And so that's why we want to stay on top of this and stay very close to direct contracting, because if we don't do it, then a plan will do it. If we don't use all the lessons that we've learned in the last 8 years, then a Wall Street private equity company will come into town. So
and just let me just add on to that, Kelly, and that's why I think if you are interested in direct contracting as an ACO, you know, as this entity that you formed to participate at that level, you know, it's the way to do it is really to partner with ValueH. You know, we've gone through the contract, we've negotiated the best terms, we've built it to keep the ACO whole and viable. And so, you know, if you're struggling with your docs trying to figure out if they want to participate or not, you can give them the best of both worlds, which is keep yourself whole and participate. And so I'd say follow up with myself or Kelly or anybody on the phone here if you're interested in going down that path.
thank you, Nicole. And Nicole, since we only have 1 minute, why don't you wrap it up? I don't think we have time for questions, but why don't you just bring it home for the last minute, and I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, I think we have less than 1 minute. So you know, again, you know, reach out to us. We're here to help either through Flacos or through ValueH. ValueH, as Kelly said, is really about bringing differential contracts, keeping these ACOs whole and viable. Flacos, of course, is networking and sharing data and best practices and all of that. We're having a conference in November in person, so we hope to see everybody at that. But, you know, info@valueh.com or info@flacos.com. Either way, you can get to experts who can answer your questions. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. One quick thing, we'll be sending out an email with the contact information if you have any additional follow-up questions. Also with a link to the webinar recording. Please feel free to share this information. Again, like Nicole and Kelly and everyone said, if you have questions, reach out. And like Nicole said, our fall conference will be November 4th and 5th of this year. We hope to see you all and have a great day.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.